Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you today to the Assessment and Prioritization of Culverts for Enhanced Fish Passage webinar. My name is Paula Hyman from the Ohio LTAP Center, and I'm going to be your technical support for today's webinar. Just a couple of items before we begin. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please type them into the questions box, and our presenter will address your questions at the end of the presentation. Also, if you have any technical issues, go ahead and type those in there as well, and I'll be happy to assist you. This webinar is being recorded, and providing that the recording is successful, a YouTube link and a copy of the presentation will be emailed to all participants and uploaded to our LTAP website. I want to thank you in advance for your participation with that, and I'm going to pass things off to Ms. Natalie Cruz Daniels, Professor of Environmental Studies in the Voinovich School of Leadership
Hi, thank you so much.
and Public Service. Natalie?
Yeah, thank you. So thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks for being here. We've been working for the past 6 months or so on really evaluating some methodologies to look at how we can prioritize culvert projects for enhanced fish passage, specifically focused in the Lake Erie Basin. This is a team effort from people at Ohio University between the Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Service and the Civil Engineering Department, specifically ORIGHT. And I am going to get started. Is my screen? Yep, my slides are advancing. Good. So, as most of you know, ODOT's responsible for thousands of culverts, and then there are culverts that have that other folks have responsibility for. But these culverts can serve as barriers to fish passage. So, if you look at this photo on the right, what you can see is that, at this sort of base flow, or at this base flow condition, sort of a normal flow condition, you can see that there's a step up from this downstream plunge pool up into these culvert structures. And so you can imagine this being a barrier to fish passage. We then look at the water flowing through that culvert, and it's a very shallow stream flowing through that culvert with a concrete base, of course. And so those multiple factors come together to make it so that fish really can't pass this during normal flow conditions. And so some of the key elements of that are this disconnection, so that elevation disconnection at the downstream end of the culvert, the substrate, so the material on the bottom of the culvert, the flow depth through the culvert, and then the flow velocity through the culvert. What we do understand, though, is that at higher flow rates, you're going to have the water on this downstream end is going to rise, and you'll no longer have that vertical disconnection at the downstream end of the culvert, because you'll have deeper water. But at that point, the velocity will be much higher, and so then only the strongest swimmers, only those fish species that are the strongest swimmers, are going to be able to get upstream. And so this project's really based around that idea that, if additional funding for infrastructure improvements to allow for culvert replacement that supports fish passage comes to fruition, how do we prioritize project locations? And then we need to think about, with improved fish passage, that the opportunities to spread invasive species also increase, and that should be considered in these projects. So the research objectives of the project that we've been working on, the ultimate goal is to look at, the scale of culverts related to, or that create aquatic organism barriers in the Lake Erie watershed, target some key high quality watersheds as focus areas for potential projects, and then identify some potential project locations for culvert conversion that allow for improved aquatic organism passage or improved fish passage. So that's broken out into a few different objectives. So, identify high quality watersheds to focus on, using a GIS approach to identify culverts that are likely to be impeding fish passage in those target watersheds, and then create a technical brief that discusses the different aspects of that work. So we took this project in three general general tasks. So a review of the pertinent literature, a prioritization of watersheds, which included a stakeholder engagement process, and then developing GIS methods for assessing culverts for improved fish passage. So I'm going to go pretty quickly into results because ultimately, you know, that's really developing this process is the key part of this project. So when we think about fish passage barriers, and I spoke a little bit about this on a previous slide, but ultimately, if we're thinking about how culverts should be constructed in order to really improve or retain the possibility for fish to swim through, retaining the natural substrate is really important. We have a lot of small fish species that are weaker swimmers that actually will swim through and use habitat within that substrate, and retaining a natural substrate can be very important to adding connectivity for those species. Retaining a natural grade. So this is thinking about the slope of that culvert or slope of that conduit. So you can imagine that you know, a circular concrete conduit with a certain slope. If that slope is higher, you're going to tend to drive higher velocity flow in those high flow events, and during low flow events, you're going to have shallower water and more intermittent flow through that steeper grade. So retaining the natural grade of the stream, the natural slope of that stream, is important for improving fish passage. Avoiding that downstream disconnection, this is probably the most obvious one, but we know that, you know, when you're at base flow and there's a physical disconnection, so a drop between the culvert and the downstream stream, that creates a physical barrier, much like a low head dam or other disconnection. And so there's been a lot of work put into identification and removal of low head dams to improve connectivity and improve fish passage. And so, you know, a lot of that knowledge can be taken into this work as well. There are also a couple of very kind of culvert or conduit specific measures that are seen as important for fish passage. And so one of them is this idea of an openness ratio. And so an openness ratio is essentially a ratio between the cross-sectional area of the culvert and the length of the culvert. And so generally, an openness ratio of greater than 1 or 1.5 is seen as positive for improvement of fish passage. And so this kind of goes to the idea of, you know, a small, confined, long culvert is going to be worse for fish passage than a more open, shorter culvert. Also, having the culvert width be greater than the bank full width, so not having that culvert be a restriction in the cross section of flow or a restriction in the stream, also improves fish passage. With the estimates or the predictions that this area will also receive more extreme weather events going into the future and more high flow events, these same principles support culverts or conduits being able to handle those higher flows as well. And so that's kind of an important element of that as well, that planning for fish passage can also plan for extreme weather events. One of the other things to consider, and this is important when we think about the invasive species as well, is that most culverts are on smaller waterways, and so our focus has been on those culverts that are on perennial and intermittent small waterways. And so the reason that's important is that there are a lot of culverts that are on ephemeral waterways, or, you know, and essentially an ephemeral is something that only runs in response to rainfall or snowmelt, so only runs in response to precipitation. And ephemeral streams while they're very important to stream ecology, they don't support fish populations. So focusing projects on perennial and intermittent waterways that support fish populations is going to be more advantageous to really having that improvement in connectivity that a culvert replacement would be aiming to have. We also, in reviewing, the importance of culvert replacement and of removing fish passage barriers, the priority generally should be given to watersheds that are high quality already, or where they're designated as high quality, but fish populations aren't meeting the targets, where additional connectivity through a culvert replacement may improve those fish populations and allow a watershed to meet its aquatic use designation. Generally, in a watershed that either isn't designated as higher quality or isn't meeting that due to other factors, so either due to water quality or due to habitat, that additional connectivity may not be the thing that helps improve it more. There may be other projects that would be a higher priority towards moving that water body towards a higher quality use. One of the important factors to consider when you're improving connectivity is that connectivity would be improved for all fish species, not just our native fish species or the fish species that we want in our water bodies. And so there is a risk of movement of invasive species as you improve connectivity. Groups in the Lake Erie Basin that have been actively working on improving fish passage through Lowhead Dam and culvert removal stated during a field visit that it's not a key concern that they look at with these projects. And I think that there are several reasons why. So, as we stated earlier, culverts are typically found on slightly smaller water bodies. And so they're usually disconnected in the headwaters, or at least in smaller order streams. And so typically their removal is not going to be the key factor in invasive passage from Lake Erie itself up into the watersheds. It's more likely that you're going to have larger structures like Lowhead dams be impediments to invasive species moving upstream than a culvert. However, it's not something to disregard as an issue. So Lake Erie does have populations of a few key invasives that are of concern. There are a number of non-native species, but they're species that aren't considered invasive, and so they're not as concerning. Sea lamprey is probably the one that we think about the most for these for culvert passage or for culvert projects, but also Asian carp and round goby. Asian carp tend to be in larger water bodies, and so not really something that we would consider around a culvert replacement. So sea lamprey seem to be the key species to manage for in these projects. One thing to consider, though, is that often these invasives are the strongest swimmers. And so I said earlier that, at high flows, we have physical connectivity through a culvert where the water rises, and so you don't have that step at the bottom of the culvert, at the downstream end of the culvert. And so the strong swimmers can make it upstream during those high flow events. And so you're generally that sea lamprey is going to be the stronger swimmer, and so that culvert may not truly be serving as a barrier to them anyway, but rather a barrier to some of the higher quality native fish. Because we're looking at GIS methods to prioritize projects, we looked at what's been done before, and GIS has been used to down select for projects, but often those methods give too many potential projects locations to evaluate. And some of that's based on what data is being used and how they're filtering it. There have been some studies that have used LiDAR to look at change in elevation due to perch culverts or dams. And the success of those really depends on the quality of the data. An ODOT funded project from Youngstown State used GIS modeling with the additional programs, fish crossing and HECRAS, to model fish passage and occurrence in a number of culverts in the Lake Erie Basin. This is a more time-consuming process, and what I'm going to present to you is our recommendation of a simpler process for using GIS. And so really what the literature suggests and what our work suggests is that GIS can be used as a starting point for project selection, but really should always be followed up with ground truthing. The other important thing to consider is that different approaches for fish passage may depend on what fish species you're managing for. And so some fish species need lower velocity water, some fish species need deeper water or need specific substrate, for example. And so some of the specific classes of fish that we focused on were intolerant taxa. So, that you may want to look at intolerant taxa and those fish that are present in cold water systems as your most sensitive species and those that are going to support a higher use designation for a stream. The two that are probably most impacted as a class by culverts are migratory species and benthic species. So those migratory species are the ones that rely on connectivity for spawning and other things, but primarily spawning. So those are the species that swim upstream to spawn and then swim back downstream. And if they can't make it upstream, then their reproduction is interrupted. And then benthic species, these are bottom dwelling species, and they tend to be weak swimmers. And so culverts can be a major impediment to them. And so really those are some of the classes of species that we want to think about when we're thinking about specific species to consider in design decisions. In addition to that, we always want to keep an eye towards economically valuable species. So these are sport fish, and to controlling invasive species. But they tend to be the strongest swimmers for whom these culverts may not be as big an impediment. So first we went through to look at prioritization of water bodies. And we did this in kind of several steps. And one part of that was really reaching out to people that are working in this space, in particularly Northeast Ohio, to see what they had in terms of projects that they had already completed, culvert replacement projects they'd already completed, and ones that they're in the planning stages of, because these would be the easiest place for ODOT to partner with an organization that's already planning a project or has identified a project location. So through that stakeholder outreach, we worked with a number of different organizations, and including the Cuyahoga, Cleveland Metro Parks, the Summit Metro Parks, several watershed groups, and we went and looked at both their planned projects and their completed projects earlier this year. So you can see on this map, those kind of reddy orange pins are places where these organizations have identified a fish passage barrier, a culvert that's a fish passage barrier, where they're planning a project if funding were to come through. And then the green ones are places where they've already done fish passage projects through culvert replacement. And so this is just an important starting point for future projects, because these are partners that already have planned projects. There are also a number of non-point source implementation strategy plans that are approved by the state. And so we reviewed plans, and these NPS-IS plans identified fish passage barriers as a critical area. So in each branch of the Chagrin, Griswold Creek, Cuyahoga River at the Village of Independence, West Creek, Baker Creek on the west branch of Rocky River, Cahoon Creek in front of Lake Erie, Boston Run, Tinkers Creek, and Big Creek, all identified structures that were impeding fish passage. And so they, across these watersheds, they identified 27 structures that were identified as drop structures or perch culverts. So some of the things that are that we see in the field, sorry, I blew this picture up and it came through a little bit grainy, but these are some of the things that we see on these culverts or conduits that impede fish passage. So you can see here, this culvert has a pretty big drop from the culvert onto this rocky riprap, and then further drops as you go downstream. And so really only the very strongest, most determined swimmers that can jump that top drop out of the culvert can make it upstream during normal flow conditions. This is another image of a conduit that impedes fish passage. So while this is pretty short and the conduit itself is pretty short and has a pretty wide opening, it has this structure that has almost a foot of drop at the downstream end at normal flow conditions. And again, you know, we don't really have very many species that could jump this and then swim through the shallow water going through that conduit to make it upstream. And then I think I showed this one already, but this is another kind of very typical picture where you have you know, almost a foot of disconnection at the downstream end of this, and then a shallow stream of water flowing through a concrete conduit that really won't support fish swimming through it, except for the strongest swimmers at high flows. We then, you know, moving into this GIS approach, we looked at focusing on high quality water bodies as target areas for projects. And so we focused our analysis on HUC 12 size water bodies. So these are typically around 40 square miles that have at least one TMDL sample location that meets or exceeds warm water habitat. So that could be warm water habitat, exceptional warm water habitat, or cold water habitat from the Ohio EPA's integrated report database. And so this focus on these high quality watersheds is really based on the premise that those high quality water bodies are going to be the ones that where connectivity may be an impediment to further improvement or to maintenance of that high quality status. Whereas those that don't have sites that are meeting or exceeding warm water habitat, exceptional warm water habitat, or cold water habitat, that there are likely other impairments that are preventing that, and that culvert replacement projects shouldn't be the first step in those watersheds. So when we look across the Lake Erie Basin, there are 192 HUC 12s in the Lake Erie Basin that meet these criteria. So we then use that down selection of area, you know, those focus watersheds, to do GIS analysis of potential culvert replacement projects. So we follow a flow chart where we start out with the conduit, and so we started out with the ODOT TIMS conduit inventory as our culvert database. This same method could be done with any culvert database, but that's where we started. We also use the National Hydrography data set, the flow lines from that, these the HUC 12 shapes, and then imagery and LiDAR and statewide maps to then analyze these data. So we clip the culverts to our focus HUC 12s. We remove storm sewers from that, and then clip the culverts to those that are within 20 feet of an NHD flow line. I'll talk more about that in a minute. We then calculate openness ratio and focus on those with low openness ratios. We then calculate the average slope of the culvert using the LiDAR data, and I will show you that in some detail in a few minutes. And then we put a decision point at 4% slope, 4% average slope, and just based on kind of the natural breaks in the data. And so if this method showed a slope of greater than 4%, we recommend ground truthing to potentially plan a project. That there may be appropriate action to ensure improved fish passage. So I'm going to walk through how we did all that. So firstly, I already showed you this map, but we focused first on the high quality watershed. So this is 192 Huck 12s in the Lake Erie Basin. We then took those culverts with the storm sewers removed, filtered to those high quality hucks, and then filtered to within a 20-foot buffer of an NHD flow line. And the reason why we filtered to within 20 feet of an NHD flow line is that gave us some level of confidence that that those culverts were likely to be on a perennial or an intermittent stream. The NHD, the National Hydrography Data Set flow lines, are in Ohio, except for I think 4 or 5 miles of stream, are intermittent or perennial waterways. There are only a few miles of ephemeral waterways that are mapped as part of the National Hydrography Data Set for Ohio. And so by filtering them within that 200-foot buffer of those flow lines, that 20-foot buffer, that gave us a little bit of wiggle room for accuracy of locations, for data accuracy, but it made sure that we weren't looking at and assessing culverts that were on ephemeral waterways. And so doing those filters gave us just under 400 culverts across the basin to analyze. We then looked at this openness ratio that I talked about earlier. So this is the cross-sectional area of the culvert divided by the length of the culvert. Ideal is 1 to 1.5 feet or greater. 11 of those 399 culverts have an openness ratio of 1 or greater. And so we filtered those out of the data set in the assumption that those are going to already be better for fish passage than the others. And so that leaves us with 388 culverts to then analyze. So then with those 388 culverts, we then downloaded the LiDAR tiles from the state database for those areas of interest only. So LiDAR data is very they're very big files, and so you don't want to download for more than the area that you're actually looking at, or your computer won't be able to run it. And so we downloaded the LiDAR tiles for the areas that we were analyzing. And we did an average slope calculation, and I will show you in more detail exactly what that looks like. But what we did was use the LiDAR to analyze the elevation of the stream upstream of the culvert and downstream of the culvert by sampling at multiple locations along that stream, and then use the length of the culvert to calculate an average slope of that culvert. Now, it's not the true slope of the culvert, right? It's not, by doing that, we're not actually saying this is the slope that that conduit runs at. What we're saying is this is the average slope from upstream to downstream across that culvert. And so a high slope is going to suggest either that there's disconnection at the downstream end, so right, that there's a plunge pool, or that you have a steeply sloped culvert, and neither of those are good for fish passage, right? And so the most likely scenario is that a high slope is really indicating disconnection at that downstream end. And so those resulting slopes can then suggest target project areas. So if you look at this map for Northeast Ohio, I showed this because it's a little bit more zoomed in. What you can see is that there's a number of culverts where that slope is actually very low, but is less than 4%. And then the blue ones are places where the slope is between 4 and 10%, and then the red ones are where the slope exceeds 10%. And so those locations with the slopes at between 4 and 10 or greater than 10 would be places that would be good starting points for doing the field inspection to determine whether these are good project locations for project planning. So I'm just showing this a little bit more zoomed in. This is for Acrola Creek up in Northeast Ohio. And so first you can see in the top left, what you can see is the HUC 12. And then in map 2 on the upper right, you can see the LiDAR tiles that are downloaded for that area to be able to analyze the slope of each of those. And then on map 3 in the bottom left, what you can see is the aerial imagery. And so we use the aerial imagery to zoom in and sample multiple locations in those 2 circles, those data selection spots. In those 2 circles, we sample the LiDAR in multiple locations to get an average elevation upstream and downstream, and then we use that to analyze that average slope. And so in maps 1 and 2 up in the top, what you can see are the results of that analysis. And so in this particular watershed, apparently we use different colors, apologies. In this particular watershed, you can see that there are two of these culverts that come out with a very high slope that would be good first places to look, and then several that are in that middle ground of 4 to 10%. That would be kind of the next places to look if you're looking for project locations in this area. So this is that analysis for all of those 388 culverts in the Lake Erie Basin. And so what you can see is that, or I guess the take home from this is that there are several places that have these, very high average slopes that suggest disconnection, and they would be that first starting point for looking for projects. So I'm just going back to this flow chart just to kind of remind us of this flow. So we start out with that data, we clip it to those high quality HUC 12s, remove storm sewers, we clip them to culverts that are within 20 feet of an NHD flow line to try to down select to those culverts that are on intermittent and perennial waterways and not ephemeral waterways. We then calculate the openness ratio, and if the openness ratio is low, and low openness ratios are generally not good for fish passage, we then calculate the average slope using LiDAR, which then lets us prioritize among those to those that have higher average slopes, which suggests disconnection. And then that would move into ground truthing or inspection that could allow you to select project areas. So this average slope method uses publicly available data. Higher resolution data can always improve accuracy, but the idea here is that by not trying to pinpoint a plunge pool or pinpoint, the downstream end of a culvert and then the stream, that we're not asking more of the data than it can necessarily give. So by sampling the stream elevation at several points upstream and several points downstream, we're able to kind of work within the accuracy of the data that we have more effectively. In terms of application of the method, if you have about 10 culverts that are near to each other, so in a similar area, so that you're just downloading a section of LiDAR tiles, about 10 can be analyzed in about an hour by a GIS tech who doesn't have a huge amount of experience. So, that analysis was actually conducted by one of our graduate students who doesn't have years of experience with GIS, and so that's about the level of effort for analyzing these. So if you wanted to apply the same method to other areas or to additional culverts or additional sites, that's the level of effort it takes. So I'm going to go into some conclusions and recommendations that we kind of highlight from this project and this effort. So generally, projects should focus in high quality water bodies, because those are the water bodies where connectivity is going to be maybe the thing that allows that water body to be improved or to get even better. whereas in a water body that has other impairments, improved connectivity isn't going to be the thing that tips the balance towards meeting a use designation from the Ohio EPA. There are regional project partners that are ready to work with ODOT on culvert replacement projects. They were eager to show us projects, eager to talk about that planning process, and are eager to potentially be partners with ODOT on this. And so that's something that I think is an important takeaway from this study. Also, this GIS analysis that incorporates LiDAR can be used to prioritize culverts based on this average slope, so the average slope from upstream to downstream across that culvert. And so it allows for manageable data sizes rather than downloading and using all the LiDAR tiles from the state or from the region at once. It allows us to download the LiDAR tiles to a focus area. And we developed this method to try to accept that data quality is going to vary, and the resolution is going to vary. And while we always want to have greater resolution on data, the reality is that we have the resolution we have. And so by sampling elevation at multiple points upstream and downstream and analyzing the culvert as a whole, rather than just trying to focus in on the downstream disconnection and plunge pool, it allows us to use the data that we have rather than the data that we want. And as always, a GIS analysis should always be a precursor for and not a replacement for ground truthing. But I think that I think it's likely that we all understand that. In terms of recommendations, we recommend that ODOT foster partnerships with the local organizations that we worked with through this project and who identify culverts as fish passage barriers in their NPS-IS plans. These are projects that, while they're not designed, they're more design ready, and oftentimes there's already been some data collected and some analysis done on those. We also think that this GIS-based analysis using LiDAR can be applied to any conduit data set as needed in the future. So while we will deliver our geodatabase of the analysis that we did for the ODOT TIMS conduit database, if there are conduit databases for local or township roads, that the same methodology could be applied with reasonable simplicity. But that narrowing down a geographic area before selecting the LiDAR tiles is going to work a lot better for just the amount of data and the computing speed. A lot of the concepts that we used as the basis for, how do you prioritize and what makes good fish passage came from the North Atlantic Aquatic Connectivity Climate-Friendly Stream Crossings Toolkit. This is publicly available online, and it includes some Great Lakes specific information. And using their design guidelines can help improve fish passage, but also help create conduits that are resilient to larger extreme weather events. Those concepts can be consistent with each other, and that can make the infrastructure be more resilient to extreme weather. And while invasive species should be included in project planning, it's not a key concern of some of the regional stakeholders, in part because these culverts tend to be further up in the watershed and not necessarily forming a barrier from Lake Erie up into a watershed that is currently preventing those species from swimming up. In terms of the process of implementation of recommendations, Ohio will deliver a geodatabase of the analysis on the culverts based on the ODOT TIMS conduit database, but the same method could be applied to other conduits as needed. We also recommend that ODOT review the projects suggested by stakeholders that we've detailed in our report as potential design-ready projects. And utilizing the Ohio analysis on the ODOT TIMS database and those projects identified by regional stakeholders really can set ODOT up to be ready for federal infrastructure funding that could support these projects, but the same methodology can be applied with reasonable ease to other areas. In terms of the expected benefits of implementing these methods, we anticipate that this could improve fish passage, which then improves aquatic communities and connectivity, and create conduits that are more resilient to extreme weather events. In terms of potential risks and obstacles to these methodologies, any GIS-based analysis is only going to be as good as the data that's used. And so that's just an important thing that we all have to keep in mind, that the resolution of the data impacts the results. We also understand that project planning with multiple stakeholders can be a challenge, and that is always a risk or an obstacle. In terms of overcoming that, we use GIS methods as a precursor rather than a replacement for ground truthing, and that there's a significant amount of knowledge and understanding from district staff and regional stakeholders that can be used in terms of that ground truthing and project location identification. Some of the potential users and other organizations that are connected to this include, of course, the ODOT Office of Environmental Services and district staff. We also worked with Chagrin River Watershed Partners, Cleveland Metro Park, Summit Metro Park, Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District. I apologize, there's a typo in that acronym, and the Western Reserve Land Conservancy. In terms of estimated costs of applying this, using the GIS-based analysis for project prioritization will cost some GIS technician time, but wouldn't change the project costs. It may just instead allow for more evidence-based prioritization of project planning. And with that, I want to say thank you for being here, and I would be happy to take questions.
So Natalie, there is a question in the queue that says, how many total HUC 12 watersheds are in this region?
That's about 300, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But I can find that number, and when I send the slides, I can send that as well.
Okay. The next question, were culverts on all types? It said state highways, county roads, etc.
So in the analysis that we did, we used all the culverts that were in the ODOT TIMS database. So my understanding is that that's state with some other roads, but that it may not have all of the locals. Is that, but that's maybe more of an ODOT question.
Okay, we'll move on here. Next one's kind of long. Do you have any sense, if any, disconnected culverts were helping with downstream water quality by providing a sediment sink, cutting off some pollution, or providing an erosion stop? Meaning, are there culvert replacements that would be good for fish passage, but potentially negative for water quality?
All right, so my, while I'm not sure about the projects that we identified in general, I think that while those plunge pools likely do collect some level of sediment, there are, you know, in a normal riffle run pool structure, you're going to have depositional areas and erosional areas. And I think that probably the scouring that results from the high velocities at the downstream end of the culvert probably is more of a source of sediment than a sink of sediment. And so I actually think that you may end up seeing an improvement because you'll have sediment sinks elsewhere, but by reducing some of that high velocity flow out of the downstream end of a culvert, particularly at higher flow events, you may actually reduce some of the scouring and erosion that's caused around the culvert. That's what I think would happen. I imagine that there are some site-specific things. I know that in removal of low head dams, it's something we always consider about, you know, whether we're going to release sediment from behind that low head dam and what's going to happen to that. So it's certainly a consideration. But I think in most of these streams, you're going to have other depositional areas, and that those plunge pools can also be a source of erosion.
Okay, next question. Sounds like this was just ODOT. How much more effort do you think it would take to do this for local and county road culverts?
So not an enormous amount of effort. if you had kind of a focus area. So like if there was a particular locality, because really, you know, once we kind of filter down to the number of these things that are actually on flow lines, it, you know, we went from like 20, like tens of thousands of culverts down to 400 that we did analysis for. And you know, about an hour to analyze about 10 of these, so about 6 minutes per culvert. And so if you're looking at, you know, a particular locality or a particular township or something like that, it wouldn't be too, I don't think it would be too onerous to do that. To do all the locals in the Lake Erie Basin would take a while.
Okay, and the last question that I have so far on here, will this data be made available to project teams where ODOT is planning future road improvements?
So we are currently packaging a geodatabase of the data we developed to deliver to Michelle. And then I guess I don't know what happens to that data once it gets to you, but our plan is to deliver all the data to you.
So, and I will say, John, that all of this information will be on the ODOT research page, as well as published nationally through TRID and everything like that through Federal Highway and stuff. So it will be available. As Natalie said, it is still in the process of being finalized. So we will get that up as soon as we can.
Yeah, we'll have that geodatabase to you. It'll probably be early next week, before we close this project.
All right. Any other questions? Okay, we just got a couple more here. Christina Patterson says, how do we get copies of the report and or detailed maps for Northwest Ohio? We are updating 20 NPS-IS plans in 2022 for Greater Toledo and could consider this data as we update development plans. So Christina, again, this is all going to be on the ODOT research site very soon. If you just kind of keep posted, I know Paula's going to send out some information, and then like I said, as soon as we finalize this report, we'll have it posted to our site. Next question said, I haven't seen the culvert design guidelines you previously mentioned. What is the most cost-effective way to mitigate the outlets? For example, should we add a gently sloped concrete apron to the outlets?
So generally, no. If you can instead do gently sloped substrate that's more consistent with the stream itself rather than concrete, you're going to have better outcomes. So like in an ideal world, when you build a culvert, you want that culvert to be embedded down into substrate that's consistent with the stream itself, or be open bottomed. I don't know your definitions of when it becomes a bridge, but open bottom or embedded down into substrate. And so gently sloping and consistent with the substrate of the stream itself is what you're looking for, rather than concrete.
All right, the next one. Are there prescriptions for correction?
I'm not really sure what that means. Like in terms of design guidelines?
Elaine, can you clarify a little bit? Paula, can we unmute Elaine? Oh, here we go. She says, yes, the design guidelines.
Yeah, so there are some, so the design guidelines, and they're not super detailed, but the design guidelines are, and there is a link to all of this in our report as well. And I will, before I send these slides to Paula, I will add a link to these in the slides. but that the substrate should be the culvert should be embedded down into substrate that's consistent with the rest of the stream. That the slope of the culvert should be consistent with the gradient of the stream, so that it's not steeper than the stream. But there are some higher gradient streams where you can get away with a higher gradient culvert. That openness ratio, so the ratio of cross-sectional area to length of the culvert, should be greater than 1, ideally greater than 1.5. And you don't want a drop structure at the bottom end, and that the width of the culvert should be greater than the bank full width of the stream. And so it ends up looking like at least wider culverts, if not bigger culverts. But you don't, essentially you don't want that culvert to end up being a pinch point that then is like a metal or a concrete bottom that then drops down to the stream down at the downstream end. Ideally, it should be a conduit that is as wide as the stream, that has similar substrate to the stream, so that your culvert's embedded down into that substrate and has a similar slope to the stream. But I will add a link to these before I send them.
Okay, we had another one come in. If the slope of the culvert is too gentle, is there a high risk for fish to be preyed upon by birds?
I don't think so. Not if you have, no. Well, okay, so if it's a high slope, a high velocity, you're not gonna have fish in there in the first place. If it's a gentler slope and you're allowing more things into there, and you have appropriate substrate, so now you have refugia for those fish, it's less likely that you're going to have that predation. I don't think it would end up being something that's like a considerable amount of predation if you kind of meet all of those things, because that a higher slope, they're just not going to swim through there.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. I don't see anything else. Paula?
I'm here. All we have coming in is thanks. That was great. Some thank yous coming in from John and Nicole. Great job. I will again send out a copy of the presentation and the link to the YouTube page where this will be posted just as soon as it's processed. That's all I have.
And thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you.